Welcome to the Filmlings podcast.
A toe-tapping podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 137, Rogers-Astaire.
Today we're talking about the one and only super famous dancing duo from the 1930s, mostly, Fred Rogers and Ginger Astaire, or otherwise known as Austerlitz and McMath, if you're nerds like us.
Yeah, and speaking of, let's get into some of their background and talk about who they are before we get into the films and entertainment that they brought to all of us together. So Fred Astaire was born Friedrich Austerlitz in 1899 in Omaha, Nebraska. His family moved to New York while Astaire was young, and their mother made Fred and his sister Adele learn dancing and singing in the hopes that their vaudeville success would provide a better life. Literally, the American dream, moved to America and joined show business. And so eventually they changed their names to avoid association with the Battle of Austerlitz. They had to take time off at certain points to avoid child labor laws. And this is why he hated top hats and tails. Because of vaudeville. He based a lot
his
of
mother made him wear the top hat and tails, and he freaking hated it.
Although there's a pretty adorable picture of him, like 8 years old, in full evening regalia. But it's also kind of ironic because the top hat and tails became his signature, and especially in contrast to someone like Gene Kelly, which we'll probably bring up later on. Astaire based a lot of his tap style on Bill Bojangles Robinson and John Bubbles Sublette. Man, entertainers have some names, I gotta say.
Are you even a tap dancer if you don't have a moniker? Those are pretty important, but we can talk about some of his influence from the African-American dance scene later on, and how he kind of brings that back into some of those movies. We actually do have some of it here in a more respectful way than some of his other films when we get to Shall We Dance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Eventually, he broke into Broadway with with the show Over the Top, a patriotic revue put on during 1917, the year that we entered World War I. He and Adele experienced stage success across the Atlantic during the 20s and did a screen test with Paramount until Adele retired after getting married and kind of settling down in 1932. And Astaire's next stage play, The Gay Divorcee, was a hit with a more romantic angle, no longer dancing with his sister, obviously, and attracted the attention of the Hollywood remake. He had another not-so-great screen test with RKO, who loaned him to MGM, as studios did in those days, for the film Dancing Lady from 1933, and then he went back to RKO for Flying Down to Rio for 1933, which was his breakout star moment when he was paired with Ginger Rogers. Initially, he was reluctant to join another partnership, but he did, and after the partnership, he focused on more musicals with different partners, retiring once early, coming back, doing more musicals, then did another retirement, did some TV and some more dramatic acting roles. And he kept up his dancing and his athleticism throughout pretty much his entire life. He even learned how to skateboard in his 70s, and there's a great clip of him dancing at the Oscars in his 70s. It's pretty great.
It's absolutely wild. If I've learned one thing, and you can take one thing away from today's episode, besides all of the Hollywood and film talk, dancing is maybe the best thing you could do for your health, apparently. Even when we get to some upcoming bonus pod content, it's very clear that dancing keeps you in very good shape well into the later parts of life. If you want to be a very agile 70 or 80 or 90-year-old, take up dancing. It is worth your time.
It's kind of funny. There's also, in kind of contrast, there's a conversation where Gene Kelly was talking about dancing as he gets older, and he's like, well, you get older and you can do less and less stuff, and then it just gets boring, so now I just like to have a good drink and a good burger. And that was his attitude. He became kind of moved into the coach or the dance choreographer role after his like dancing days were more or less over.
Yeah, very much considered to be the opposite side of the style coin from Fred Astaire in a lot of ways. One more graceful, one more assertive, or I guess masculine, maybe, and powerful in his form of dance. Not necessarily in a judgy way, just talking about like the
As
traditional
opposed to the
concepts
grace
of
and poise
feminine,
of
masculine,
Astaire.
and art. Yeah, exactly. But we also have to talk about Fred Astaire's partner, the one to which he gives a lot of the credit. Fred Astaire, by the way, is one of the most like generous, affable, well-loved people in the history of Hollywood. People just adore that guy, and he has a penchant, which is part of the reason that people love him, for shoving all of the credit towards other people. He gave it a lot to his choreographer, Hermes Pan, even though Hermes Pan went on record multiple times as saying, like, I helped on this movie, but I don't deserve a choreography credit. Fred Astaire did all of it. But Fred Astaire also gave Ginger Rogers a huge part of the credit, and Ginger Rogers deserves a good portion of it. Ginger Rogers, born Virginia Catherine McMath in 1911 in Independence, Missouri, which is why we made that joke about Austerlitz and McMath, which is the alternate timeline version of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Her parents separated when she was very young, and her father actually kidnapped her twice before they actually finally divorced, and she moved in with her grandparents while her mother went to become a writer and producer in Hollywood for a short time. She moved back with her mother in Fort Worth, Texas, of all places, when Mom remarried again and became a theater critic and developed an interest in theater in Hollywood, which would influence Ginger's interest in theater in Hollywood. In 1925, as a young woman, she won a Charleston dance contest and got to tour as Ginger Rogers and the Redheads. Her young cousin couldn't pronounce Virginia, and thus the nickname Gingy or Ginger was born. Touring brought her to New York City, where she landed a Broadway role in the musical Top Speed and the musical Girl Crazy. The later was one of her first star breakthroughs, and a play where Astaire actually helped with the choreography, although they didn't form much of a friendship or working partnership at the time. You'll also notice that for Ginger Rogers, it's kind of a story of having to have multiple star breakthroughs. Like, it doesn't always come all at once. You kind of have to do it time and time again. So she won a contest. She went to New York. She got in a musical where she was considered a star on stage, but her breakthrough in film was yet to come. She started in a series of short films in 1929, all produced in New York, which was a bigger film market at the time, before appearing in several musicals, eventually making another breakthrough as Anytime Annie in the musical 42nd Street, which was featured in our musicals episode, by the way. Another big early musical she was in was Gold Diggers of 1933, which I always have to mention because I will never not have the song "We're in the money, we're in the money" stuck in my head. But it is fabulous. It is kind of like an over the top glitzy 1933 musical that also has. It's Busby Berkeley, and it contrasts glitz with like depression and the Great Depression, not the medical condition. But it's worth a watch, and it has a very signature Ginger Rogers role in it. She then moved to RKO, where she starred in Flying Down to Rio and created some screen magic with Astaire, which was again considered a breakout role. After the partnership, she focused on more dramatic acting. And as well as some more comedic roles, but stuff kind of away from the idea of musical comedy or musical drama. So she starred in Stage Door in 1937, towards the end of her partnership with Astaire. That movie, actually, she partnered with Katharine Hepburn in. Kitty Foyle in 1940, which has some controversial content in it, but also kind of pushed the envelope as a dramatic film for her as well. And, of course, the comedy Monkey Business in 1952, which she stars in, along with the likes of Cary Grant and Marilyn Monroe. Monkey Business is really wacky.
Yeah.
I absolutely love Monkey Business. It's very raunchy, but it also isn't like it doesn't outdate itself that much either. Like, I don't think there's too much inappropriate content. It's it's like an appropriate amount of raunchy, with just some over the top wackiness and some really good screwball humor in a film from 1952, which is kind of past the screwball prime, but it's interesting nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. And not quite out of the Haze era, so it's
No,
like
not
getting
quite out of
that
the
weird
Haze era.
tension time.
Yes.
People are pushing the envelope.
After the 1950s, she mostly retired from film and returned to a very successful series of stage productions and occasionally made TV appearances, both for the sake of doing it and because TV appearances typically pay well. And if you're a retired actor, you'll notice, especially for Fred Astaire did it too, for a lot of the actors in that kind of cohort that kind of started to age out of film roles in the 50s, they mostly diverted into TV for occasional appearances to continue to make some money here and there and participate in the industry. At the age of 74, she finally fulfilled a lifelong dream of directing with an off-Broadway production of the musical Babes in Arms, which is a screenplay of a musical comedy centered around women during the war of, I don't think it's World War II. I think it's actually based on World War I, and the musical came out in the late 20s, early 30s, originally on Broadway. So it's probably a show that she was aware of or working around or near, if not on, during her tenure on Broadway in the late 20s, early 30s. But anyway, it's just nice that she was able to cap off her career with finally doing directing, since that's something she was so interested in. But those are our characters, Jonathan. So what are the stories, the films, the plays, the scenarios that we are talking about?
Yeah, we're starting off with The Gay Divorcee from 1934, directed by Mark Sandrich, based on the Broadway play The Gay Divorce, which was Astaire's last stage play. And it's actually interesting that the play was called The Gay Divorce, but the studio system thought that made it sound too much like divorce is a good thing, so they changed it to The Gay Divorcee, so it sounds like someone who's already divorced is just having a good time. It's like, and apparently they also like offered $50 to anyone on the production who could come up with a better name. That's how sensitive people were
Branding
being.
is hard, y'all.
Put one extra E on there, and it changes it just enough to get past the censors.
All you have to do is make it French. Divorcee.
And we'll be following that with Shall We Dance from 1937, also directed by Mark Sandrich, and based on the formula of the Broadway hit On Your Toes. And lastly, we will be looking at the last film that stars Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, The Barkleys of Broadway from 1949, directed by Charles Walters. And this is 10 years after the last film that they had produced in their like official partnership. And there's some other
this one wasn't even supposed
drama.
to be it wasn't supposed to be a partnership for that movie, but it ended up being that, which is an interesting part of the story.
Looking back on it, like, how could it not be? Like, it's made for them.
It does. It's one of the reasons that we picked it was because it kind of mirrors a lot of their...
It's so meta.
It mirrors a lot of their own trajectories in their own careers and paths. Of course, there's a lot of meanness and hate in between the characters in the Barkleys of Broadway, and everything I could find about the partnership between Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers was that it was a friendly, professional, completely amicable partnership. There doesn't seem, I can't seem to find any drama between the two of them at all, which is wild. Not even like a rumor of drama.
That's
I can't find any of it. And they're both two figures that are really well respected again throughout the Hollywood legacy. Especially as a man in Hollywood, Fred Astaire kind of has a similar reputation to Jimmy Stewart in a lot of ways. Fred Astaire was married twice, which is way below the Hollywood average, especially for that time period. But
he was a widower. His first wife died.
Yeah. The only reason he remarried was because his first wife died, and then he only married someone else after like 20 more years or something like that. He was very quiet, private, kept to himself. And the only other really fun tidbit I have about him before we move on into the meat of the films is that he was considered one of the most stylish people in Hollywood. And whereas Cary Grant was kind of the other one and known for wearing very formal attire, Fred Astaire kind of dressed down. He was basically like the 1930s, 1940s equivalent of streetwear, like really cool, sleek streetwear. He would he was very well known for using a necktie actually as a belt.
Oh,
like
he
that
does
was like
do that.
That was like the cool, sleek look of like young on the street, young late teenager, early 20s kind of vibe. A very casual streetwear kind of vibe. Of course, this isn't the Fashionlings, but I wanted to throw that out there because I thought it was really interesting. And there's, of course, a lot more you can dig into both of these people's biographies. But we're actually here to talk about their partnership. So without further ado, let's jump into it with the Gay Divorcee from 1934. Jason, take it away.
The Gay Divorcee from 1934. Mimi Glossip's husband hasn't been around since they've been married, and he refuses to get a divorce as that would cut him off from Mimi's family money. So Mimi hires a lawyer to arrange for her to be caught in a staged affair, forcing her husband's hand into a divorce. They're supposed to meet at an English seaside resort, but by a twist of the fate of fools, she meets Guy Holden instead, a mischievous dancer who's already fallen for her. Through a miscommunication, she thinks Guy is both her arranged fake lover and the husband of her Aunt Hortense, of which he is neither, and so a comedy of errors ensues.
All right, so one of the reasons why we picked the Gay Divorcee, and probably a good place to start with talking about Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, and specifically their canon as a whole, is that while they made 10 films together, those 10 films can kind of be broken up into some subcategories. Some of them
the
actually
Heisei period.
Surprising. Yeah, well, it's kind of Swiss cheesed a little bit. There's some of them that are a little experimental, and those are focused towards the end of their career, like Carefree, the Barkleys of Broadway, and Vernon and Irene Castle, the story of Vernon and Irene Castle, which is like a biopic. It's actually really good. I highly recommend that one.
That's the last one before their break, right?
Yes. Those are actually the last 3 films they made together. That's kind of like the experimental period where they're trying to grow. You can tell that Ginger Rogers is trying to do more dramatic acting. Fred Astaire gets more solo numbers. The format of the movie switches up. It doesn't feel like the same. And this isn't meant in a rude way, but the template that kind of like classic Hollywood and Mark Sandrich uses, which comprises the other 2/3 of their canon. But even those 2/3 can be split into 2 kinds of movies. And I think it might literally be, I think it's split 3 and 4, where 3 of them, like Flying Down to Rio, have them basically in a secondary role. I know Follow the Fleet does as well, where they're basically in a secondary role and they're basically supporting actors. They still steal the spotlight because, of course they do. They're the best dancers and triple threats on screen. But there's some other focus on it. Roberta's the other one because they pulled in another actress whose name I don't remember, but she's a big deal, to kind of take the dramatic lead while they kind of took like the supporting role backseat. But of course, there's those other 4 films, The Gay Divorcee, Shall We Dance, Top Hat, and Swing Time, that focus on these 2 actors as the main focus. They're the leads, they're the dramatic leads, the comedy leads, the romantic leads, all of it. So The Gay Divorcee is their second film together. It was the one that happened after Flying Down to Rio, which was the oops, these 2 are really good together. This one is these guys are good together. The Hollywood machine started turning and was like, let's make them into a famous partnership, put them together.
Plus, Fred Astaire's already done the role on Broadway, so it's a pretty easy bet.
It was the perfect fit. Yeah, of course. You have easy access to the IP. You have the star from the Broadway show. You have a new partner in it. It's a very easy sell and setup, and they put all the focus on these 2 as well, which I think is important because you kind of start to see their on-screen dynamic develop for the first time, and it's nice to see them in leads. And it's also interesting to see because right from the get-go, you can tell how different their talents are, as well at the same time as how similar they are, because they're both very good. But Fred Astaire is clearly more experienced in the dancing, and Ginger Rogers is more experienced in the acting, even
Yeah.
though they're definitely triple threats all around. And this is the definition of a big, glitzy 1930s movie. It is very much meant as a sell and a distraction from the Great Depression, which was in full swing at the time. And this was meant to be a big, glitzy, made-up fantasy land, basically. It's supposed to be, I think, a sea resort in England that most of the story takes place at.
It's Lubitsch land. It doesn't matter.
Yeah. Oh, that's exactly.
get there.
That's a fantastic point. It is Lubitsch land. It's this made-up metropolitan. Well, not completely made up, but essentially a heightened version of a metropolitan Europe where everyone magically speaks English. They just all speak it with a funny accent. Everyone has a curled mustache, or some other traumatic thing. Everyone has like just money upon money to throw away. Money I don't think is ever even brought up as an issue, besides the fact that Ginger Rogers' husband character is a lech, or a leech, basically. But yeah, it's a very big, fancy setup. Had you seen this one before, Jonathan, or was this your first experience with the film?
I haven't seen any of these, actually. I think I'd seen Follow the Fleet, but I hadn't seen any of these specifically.
Oh, yeah. And Follow the Fleet is definitely one of the ones that's fun, but it definitely puts them in the back seat. And there's this, I don't want to say waste, but you spend a lot of time on this basically other movie that's happening, and you just want to see Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, especially looking from our like 2022 vision.
Yeah.
Back on it. You're like, I'm here for Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Let's see more of them. But in this one, we get to see we get to see them focused on, and you get to see this big world. What do you think of the big glitzy made up world? Were you able to find yourself being immersed in it, or were you finding it a little fake?
Yeah, I mean I'm familiar with the type of film and the type of world, so it wasn't like shocking or anything. I think the balance I'm always trying to find in these movies is like, how much do they want me to care about the story, and how much do they just want to get to the next song, you know? And there's definitely those moments, and apparently there's more or less kind of some stock types of dances that would happen, especially in Fred Astaire films. And this is early. So like you said, this is the second one that they've been in together. So some of these, if you want to call them like almost formulaic things, aren't really established, but they're kind of getting there. So you have like Astaire will almost always have a solo at some point. He'll also have a comedic dance with a partner. In all these cases, obviously Ginger Rogers. And then there's also a dramatic dance that they have together. And Fred Astaire did have, it was one of his, one of the things that he brought to the musical genre, the musical film, was to incorporate the dances and the songs into the storyline rather than just kind of breaking the storyline to throw in some musical numbers. Like even Singing in the Rain, which is kind of homaging back to some of these, but it's still just kind of, there are moments where you're watching a dance scene because it's a dance scene. And that's much later. But in these films, they do incorporate it to some extent. Some of them kind of come out of nowhere, like Let's Knock Knees, which is the most suggestive song I've ever heard. It just kind of comes out of nowhere.
It's got a very pre-code vibe to it.
It has
sure.
a very Lubitsch vibe to it. And then the Continental too, which is also interesting because it's kind of unusual for some of the later Astaire and Rogers types films because, first of all, it's 17 minutes long, which is ridiculous. And also it uses a lot of really fast cutting and almost a Busby Berkeleyan tone to it, but not fully. It's not quite as extravagant as that. But in later films, Fred Astaire would kind of take over the direction of pretty much all of the dancing sequences, even though they have the director. And I think even Gene Kelly would do that he would kind of be co-director just because so much of the dancing and stuff would be directed by him in the acting and the choreography. But Fred Astaire would eventually go on to kind of insist that the dances be filmed in as long of takes as possible, that the camera is on a dolly, tracking with the dances so that they can be seen in their entirety, as opposed to cutting a lot of times and seeing it from a bunch of different angles. You are actually like watching the performance rather than kind of having the performance thrown at you, or
you're not watching a simulacrum of the performance.
Yeah,
you're not watching Liam Neeson jump over a fence in
it is
5 or 6
like
cuts.
It's like a fight scene that you're watching the whole thing, like in a classic wuxia versus Jason Bourne, where it's cut very fast, which is its own style. It just becomes a thing when that's the only style that Hollywood uses.
Yeah, it can be its own style. It can also be a huge handicap.
Or cop out,
yeah, if somebody can't fight, which everyone always points to. I think the most recent, or not the most recent because there wasn't one before it, but the only Iron Fist series on Netflix, where the fighting was very obviously done by stunt doubles, which isn't bad, but the cutting around it was trying to carry most of the work, and it just wasn't jiving.
And on the flip side, the John Wick films did a really good job of like showing fight scenes in like steady locked off shots so you can actually see the action. Anyway, this isn't about shoot 'em up movies.
It kind of is though, because it gets back to the point that I think it's actually pretty relevant that you bring up modern action films. And I think to a further extent, modern like Marvel movies or something like that, where essentially you have a kind of film which people debate the merit of those movies all the time, but I think they fill kind of the same role in the media diet of our modern times that a Busby Berkeley or a Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers musical of the 1930s would fill as well, where there's some construction and theming in there, but most of the work is being put into the spectacle, right? So and they're really, really good at it. So obviously in the Gay Divorcee, when they set up those long camera shots and you can just watch them dance for the Continental for 15, 20 minutes straight, which that last sequence of the Continental is like legitimately a whole act of the movie. It's crazy long.
Yeah.
It's so long. Actually, if you look at all the Letterboxd comments and reviews, they're all about how long the final dance sequence is, which I find really funny because it's only an hour and a half long movie.
Yeah.
But it is, everyone's like, wow, that last dance scene. But all that to say, the focus is very much on the spectacle. And then we build a story around it to support that, but the story might start to feel a little cookie cutter after a little while, after we see 4 or 5 of the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers movies, which isn't bad because I enjoy them.
Yeah. I will say, though, that there is a Lubitchian twist at the end, which is pretty good.
There is, which is fantastic. And there's some wit, some very good wit in a lot of these films. And you can tell that Mark Sandrich is more than just a scarecrow in the director's seat.
Yeah.
At some points in these films, but for the most part, they start to build and adapt a formula. But I do think it's also interesting what you said earlier about how they integrate the musical numbers, because the other big musical powerhouse at this point in time, and there were plenty of musicals coming out in the 30s. They were very popular throughout the 30s. Was Busby Berkeley. Mm-hmm. And I think we talked about that in, at the very least, the musicals episode. I can't remember if we did a dedicated Busby Berkeley episode.
Not yet, but that would be
because there's been so many of them. But if we've covered over 400 films, as we like to remind ourselves.
Yeah. We did talk about 42nd Street, which wasn't officially Busby Berkeley, but he might have had a small hand in that one.
And I think as other younger from a younger generation of musicals have popped up, we've talked before about how so many of those are actually almost fully framed around the construction of a musical. Like it's a musical, but it's almost always a musical about a musical.
That's right.
And
that was what our musicals episode was about.
I literally thought that for a while there that was like the only way that Hollywood knew how to how to justify music being in a musical. They were like, there's no way people are going to randomly start singing and dancing. But these films from 1934, or even Flying Down to Rio, and onward, kind of show the opposite of that. Well, I guess Flying Down to Rio is a little different because it's themed around a band. And in many of these films, you still have,
in a sense, the characters are performers, but they're not like
performers.
putting on a musical and like behind the scenes drama, which is different.
Yeah, like literally, like a lot of the Busby Berkeley movies, the music, song, and dance numbers are just squeezed in through like the rehearsals and then the final performance.
Yeah.
So there's like a dramatic storyline going on that's a little separate from the dance numbers, and the dance numbers only exist because the dramatic storyline is centered around actors and performers, singers, and dancers who happen to be part of this play. So we're going to take a break every once in a while from the drama to watch them rehearse.
Right. Although I will say, I just remembered that like the way that this film opens is definitely one of those things where it's like, this is a movie about dancing. This isn't really a movie about the story, because in the very first scene of this film, it's Fred Astaire and Egbert, a guy played by Edward Horton, who shows up a lot in these movies. And I think he was in Arsenic and Old Lace too. Anyway, they're like out to dinner at this nice restaurant, and both of them have forgotten their wallets, or quote unquote forgotten their wallets. And so Fred Astaire has to prove that he's a famous dancer and he's good for the money by doing an entire dance sequence. But it's like literally just an excuse to make him do dancing. And that's like the first thing we see is like, oh, I have no money, so I got to dance. And so we just, dances like, okay, so this is what we're about here.
Yeah, pretty much. It's very interesting to watch this whole formula basically get set up in this movie. And this was the super successful formula, the one that put Astaire and Rogers first. Because like I mentioned, and while we're not going to be focusing in on those films, like Roberta, which is one of the ones that backseats them, or Flying Down to Rio, even in those films, Ginger and Fred have that. Can I call you Ginger and Fred? I feel like we know each other now. Ginger and Fred have, or Astaire and Rogers, Austerlitz and McMath have this star quality to them that just crackles. And even when they're in that kind of subordinate role, they just light up the screen. Everyone focuses on them. It doesn't matter if you put them in a supporting role; they're gonna steal the spotlight. The only time that I've seen them kind of actually be backseated is in something like Stage Door, which is one of Ginger Rogers' later efforts. Not super late, but after the partnership efforts, where she's starring alongside Katharine Hepburn, and so she has an even more gigantic star to contend with.
Yeah, especially when you're talking
with
competing drama. That's hard to go up against.
And in the Gay Divorcee, it's interesting because we're going to see this contrast. But in the Gay Divorcee, the storyline is it's much more romantic. A little more like a different sort of romance. And the formula that we'll eventually see emerge, and that seems to work a little better, which still involves romance, is kind of like this more friendlier version of a romance. Like you sense the friendship a little stronger, and then when they really turn it on, you sense they can crackle that romantic chemistry on screen. But by the time we get to Shall We Dance, like it very much feels like a friendship first, and then kind of like a romance growing out of that. Which, by all accounts, from what I've heard, is kind of like the best sort of romance. But it definitely tracks with the idea of their partnership being like a tight friendship, no romantic involvement, very professional, and just good friendship chemistry right off the bat through all of their work.
Yeah, that is something that I want to bring up though, because so this definitely their part of the storyline is kind of driven by these kind of screwball undertones and stuff like that. I mean, to the point where it has to be played.
Oh, it's a full-on comedy of errors. It's got some Shakespearean, like everyone misunderstands everybody. Everyone doesn't understand what's going on or just makes bad assumptions until they're all like whacking each other. And all it's missing is a pair of identical twins, really.
Yeah. And there's even more of that in Shall We Dance. But in this one, there's also kind of that fine line that some of the screwballs have where, like, at the beginning, the whole thing is that he has, like, seen her and that is this one. So he meets her on the ship or whatever, and then he basically can't find her and has this, like, semi-Cinderella, semi-stalking kind of storyline where he's, like, searching for her, and then he kind of fits into her own plans. But it is kind of like aggressive in the way that he's pursuing her for parts of the film. Like, almost
for sure.
with the like Bugs Bunny use of the road closed sign and that kind of stuff. But the point is that in a lot of these films, I think it's really interesting if you watch the dancing. The dancing is used in place of seduction in a lot of ways. The first time that they dance, like, she's mad at him the first time that they dance in the Gay Divorcee, and because she thinks that well, actually, she doesn't think so yet, but she just is, like, really bothered with him. She's got her own crap that she's dealing with, and he keeps popping up in her life, and she's like, just go away. And then they dance, and then she's just kind of, like, left there stunned, and he literally offers her a cigarette. Like, it's the most kind of double entendre sort of thing, and it's a lot more subtle in some of the other movies, but there's still that thing. Like, we're going to talk, like, even in Barkleys of Broadway, a dance is what brings them together. The dance itself, the act of dancing, is kind of the thing that sparks the romance between them on this really kind of romantic level. And
that
so
makes
I
a lot
think
of
it's
sense.
really interesting.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's a stand-in for a lot of physical contact and testing of, like, chemistry, everything from, like, being able to match mental chemistry, romantic chemistry, and even just being able to be, like, in step, pun intended, with each other's bodies throughout the dance. That is kind of like part of building a relationship that is basically not allowed to be shown under the Hays Code, and it's finding a way to slip it in there. It's like the Walls of Jericho, but even more subtle.
Exactly.
Which
And even
is
more visual for the audience.
Happened One Night reference.
Right.
And even more visual for the audience. And probably one of the most, like, it's hard because we have to put it in context of a 1930s audience, not in our terms where I'm willing to bet most people have had to awkwardly sit through a sex scene in a movie or a TV show with their parents while watching it with their parents. And, you know, just like the sheer amount of like nudity and that we're exposed to from an early age means we're fairly desensitized to it. But in the 1930s, I mean, think about the 1920s, it was like a shocker and a scandal when women cut their hair short and suddenly you could see their necks.
Or Katharine Hepburn puts pants on.
Or Katharine Hepburn puts pants on. So in 1930s, maybe one of the most, like, I guess, titillating things you could see on screen were two people being extremely close to one another, moving in sync in this lovely, beautiful dance. It was probably very exciting to watch, and then probably very exciting to try to imitate at your local dance club or whatever the equivalent would be. When I say dance club, I meant like the 1920s version of a dance club or the 1930s, but for all I got in my head was an image of but I think we all know what I mean.
Yeah. And I will say, like, in contrast, like what you're saying is there was another place you could kind of get the kind of titillating excitement, and that was the more Busby Berkeley type dances, because Busby Berkeley was also kind of notorious for really pushing the censors on what he was allowed to show of the women that he was choreographing. And he
had some very Ziegfeld Follies type.
Yeah, but this is not
content.
exploitative. This is just like like just intimate two people being very close together. So just in contrast to a more sort of sensational type of dancing.
Busby Berkeley movies are fun, but the dance numbers, like I guess the kind of like diddling visual aspect of them would be putting essentially a series of female bodies on display in like an organized pattern.
In their bathing suits or tutus.
In their bathing suits or their tutus, or zooming the camera through like 20 people lined up in a row. Like I'm thinking of the shot where he zooms through all of their legs.
Yeah.
Like to us.
That the Big Lebowski copied.
Yeah, exactly. Like to us in in 2022, it's like, I mean, it's just some calves. But in, 1934 or whatever, I'm sure that was like exhilarating to people in the audience, or at least very shocking to many. So, and you kind of have to understand where the censorship and exposure to media was so different. We hadn't had as much exposure to it as whole as a society. We just hadn't been desensitized yet. For better or worse, we hadn't been desensitized yet. So a lot of this content in these films, it becomes very different when you think about it from the anachronistic angle.
Yeah. All right, shall we move on to Shall We Dance from 1937?
I think we shall move on to Shall We Dance. Jason, shall you read the summary?
Shall We Dance from 1937. Ballet star Petrov and famous actress Linda Keane crossed the Atlantic on the same ocean liner. Linda Keane is quitting her acting career, tired of the forced romances she has to perform on stage, to marry a fuddy-duddy stockbroker in New York. Petrov isn't Petrov, but Peter P. Peters, an American dancer masquerading as a Russian at his manager's design, is growing tired of not being able to perform his preferred tap dance, which his manager thinks is unprofessional. Interested in keeping their respective acts intact, Keane and Petrov's managers begin manipulating their friendship into a publicity stunt marriage. As the stunt grows out of control, the two are forced to dance the line between fake and real romance.
All right, Jonathan. So this is Shall We Dance from 1937, and it's probably most significant for being one of the later of the essentially slice of Ginger and Astaire, the Fred and Ginger, Astaire and Rogers, Austerlitz and McMath movies focused around them two as the center, and it's probably the most evolved form of their kind of formula that they came up with before they started to change the formula and riff on the formula in Carefree in their last three movies. But in this one, we have a very interesting setup where we have two professional performers with two very different angles, and we're starting to see some of their friendship is much more present on screen early on, where they just kind of click. They already have that friendship chemistry going on.
There still is a point of Astaire having to pursue Rogers' character.
Yes,
but she comes along a lot quicker.
Yeah, it's a lot less forceful. It's much more. It jives a lot quicker with our more modern sensibilities, and I do think a lot of that, even with like when we were talking about it with the Gay Divorcee, was some of it was just like that was, I guess, the concept of like romantic pursuit at the time was being super forceful, and to a certain extent, not necessarily, and none of this is healthy. The woman was essentially expected to kind of like put up a bit of a fight to advances, and none of this is obviously healthy, but you see a lot of that expressed in these movies where the man like keeps following her around. She's like, no, don't. But
and then he just gets more dogs, and that does the trick.
Yeah, exactly. That section, of course, I loved because I'm a dog fanatic. But there's a lot more comedy bits in this one.
Oh my gosh, there's so much comedy.
There's so much comedy. There's a lot of like dialogue comedy, which I'm sure you can talk about for days, Jonathan.
Between Eric Blore and Edward Horton
Edward
the two
Horton,
guys that show up in all of these, but they're like here it's almost it's like taken to another level, like with Eric Blore like lisping his like scream lisping into the telephone because no one can understand him, and Edward Horton, I actually started to feel sorry for him at the point where they're like they basically haze him.
He gets stuck in jail. Yeah.
Well, no, Eric Blore gets stuck in jail, and then Edward Horton, there's like a fire alarm on the boat, and they just let him think that the boat's actually on fire, and he like runs out while everyone's on deck in his underwear, and it's almost kind of pathetic, but yeah, so they're just like pushing and all of that is like very sideline. Like that has some impact on the plot, but it's mostly just like comic relief for comic relief.
Yeah, it's a lot of comic relief. There's a lot of more side characters in this one, whereas I think the main cast including side characters in the Gay Divorcee can be kept to like 5-6 people.
Oh, we didn't even talk about the Italian.
We did not talk about the Italian in Shall We Dance. The Italian is hilarious, though.
Your wife is safe with
Obviously just a
Tonetti. He
character
prefers spaghetti.
That Antoni Faletti, what's his name?
Tonetti. Yeah, I don't know.
Antonio Tonetti?
Rodolfo
like
Tonetti, yeah.
Rodolfo Tonetti.
Italian.
He likes spaghetti.
And his wife is cheating on him, too.
His wife is cheating on him, too. You know, that scene where he was talking on the phone to his wife, and then he was like, "Oh, my son's voice has dropped so much."
He's
Just
only 9.
reminded me of Stalag 17 when with the one guy who got a letter from his wife saying she just happened to find a baby on her front step that looks so much like her. And he was like, "I believe her. I believe her. Yeah, I believe her."
Again, that's all straight out of Lubitsch.
Yeah, all straight out of Lubitsch. All very good comedy. But to bring it back to Shall We Dance, this is a much more robust film. The characters are way more developed. They're much less cardboard cutouts.
Cartoonish,
basically,
yeah.
they're less template-y and more actual people with wants and needs. For most of the film, we actually have characters who are pursuing a want very against their need. Like Ginger Rogers' character being so dead set on marrying this one fuddy-duddy dude, just to get out of dancing, or her performance because she doesn't like the setups that her agent puts her in. When obviously there's also a guy that she's kind of fallen in love with, in Fred Astaire, and it takes her the whole movie to be like, "Oh wait, if I wanted to get married or like change my career, I could have just been with you the whole time." And of course that's what happened. Yeah. Spoiler.
She did marry him, and she still didn't want it.
Yeah, whoops. But the plot's more intricate. It's got more twists in it. Of course, it's nothing like as intricate as the most complex film noirs or something like that.
Yeah.
But it is more developed. You can tell this team has been working together. Mike Sandridge is back. We still have the recurring cast of Edward Everett Horton, Eric Blore, and Alice Brady, again, who are all... Actually, I don't remember if Alice Brady's in this one, but she was in The Gay Divorcee.
Yeah.
She's in quite a few other of them. She also normally plays Ginger Rogers' aunt, which is weird because the actress is like the same age as Ginger Rogers. So she would go from playing her aunt to also then playing like
Her sister.
Like essentially her sister, or like the same role as Ginger Rogers in a different movie.
Yeah.
But all that is to say, this is only 3 years later, but with the production schedule of peak or classical age Hollywood, this is kind of the development that you get. And we've talked about that before with, or a version of this before with a lot of the working directors like Howard Hawks, and other folks who kind of came up in a studio system where a lot of their original work was just them having scripts tossed at their face and being like, make that. And they did that like 2 or 3 times a year. And the result is that you do it so much that you get good at it and you get to develop your own style. A lot of, this is just a little sidetrack pet peeve of mine, but a lot of people try to focus out of the gate on trying to make like the most perfect film in the world, or their most perfect film in the world. And the key is actually just to make a lot of movies until you figure out how to make the best movie in the world. Of course, that's harder now because it's
Fail
expensive.
early.
But yeah, exactly. All that is to say, you can see the growth in the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers partnership here. He's become a better actor. She's become a better dancer. They have more chemistry together, and the whole cast and crew around them has gotten more skilled and more in tune with one another as well. And it just shows throughout this whole film.
Yeah, and I mean, going along with that, they're upping their skill is the rollerblade scene, which I guess if putting in the little formula would be the comedy dance between them. And the rollerblades is freaking amazing. It's like it's almost like they watched Modern Times and they were like, "Oh yeah, Chaplin, that ain't nothing. We can tap on our freaking rollerblades." And yeah, synchronized rollerblading and tapping is just incredible.
It's pretty wild, actually. That's one of them. They have some crazy dance numbers throughout their whole like collection of films.
Yeah,
but that one is absolutely nuts.
Yeah, and I do think there's also the moment in here that's going to be important in the next film, which is They Can't Take That Away From Me, which is when basically they've been spending the whole day together. They've been spending several days together because they're fake married. Well, then they get real married, but she's still planning to get divorced just to call off the press, and then she can marry the other fuddy-duddy guy. Anyway, then Fred Astaire sings this song with no dancing, just them there, sings this song to her about all the little things, all the memories that he's going to have even after their relationship is over, their fake / real relationship. And that comes up in a really important way in the next film. And I guess the other thing is, okay, so again, in terms of towing the line with creepy, is the last dance, where his big gesture of love is that he joins her show, and she has refused to do the show because she's so upset about all the press and stuff. And he's like, well, then we'll just make every one of the other dancers her. And they like make masks of her, and it's like,
yeah,
it's literally like the Taylor told me this too, but it's like the Shia LaBeouf video.
Oh my gosh, it is like actual cannibal Shia LaBeouf.
Yeah, but it's just like it's toes this line between like a creepy Twilight Zone setup and like a really romantic grand gesture kind of a thing. And then they have the fun.
He's chasing you through the woods, Shia LaBeouf.
They have the fun Russian doll kind of thing where she's hiding behind her own mask, and he has to figure out which one she is. But yeah, so that the ending is it's grand and beautiful, but also a little head turning.
But it also comes off as a little creepy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes classical Hollywood just can't help itself.
They just have an idea and they got to run with it. And I will say also, in terms of creepy, this film cameos in Joker. Apparently,
yeah,
there's a point where he dances to the Slap That Bass song, which we didn't even really touch on, but that's
I think we actually didn't we watch Joker together at the same point in time when I was in Texas for a little bit?
We did. You plugged your phone into the TV or something?
Yeah, because my parents don't have internet. Yeah, they're really dead set on not having internet. Yeah. So yeah,
don't hold your
Joker.
breath for us to cover Joker though, guys.
Don't. It's I think we have to wait until the era of superhero movies, however that happens, comes to an end or dwindles. And for those of you who don't think it will come to an end or dwindle, I have some bad news for you. There has been so many eras in movie history that people have been so sure that this would be the way forever, like musicals are a good example. But things change. Things change, and Marvel movies they might still be around in some way, shape, or form, but who knows?
Well, the saddest thing is that as soon as something else surpasses superhero movies, then within just a couple of years, superhero movies will be high art, which some people consider them that now. But the point is that once it gets surpassed and becomes nostalgic, then it becomes even more of like a held up thing, which
it's hard to fight nostalgia. Yeah, I mean, it's even something to take in consideration with this discussion here, is that we don't want to be like, oh, it was made in the 1930s, it must be brilliant.
Right.
And of course, to a certain extent, there was more effort put into some parts of these films than I think they would have been at other points in the future. But that's one of the reasons why I think it's such a just analog to the Marvel movies.
Which is why, I mean, even if you just look
focus
at
on their spectacle, and they have serviceable scripts. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not knocking Marvel writers here, but like the script is not the point of the Marvel movie.
The script was
not
good
by
for
a
the
long
first
shot.
5 movies that were the same.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Like these, we're talking about these dance movies, these musicals, but in some way we kind of have to talk about them all together. We can't really talk about them individually too much because like they are kind of all a development on the same formula, the same
theme,
setup, the same theme. So, you know, you kind of have to talk about them all together. So yeah,
and the
when
other thing
Marvel
is
movies
even,
die down, we'll do a Marvel movie podcast.
Even just the way that we're talking about these movies, like versus the way that we talk about other movies, like we're not really talking about the technique and the directorial eye and stuff. And like Mark Sandrich is a good director, but he's not a Howard Hawks or a Hitchcock. He knows how to shoot these comedies where you get everyone lit, and Fred Astaire tells you where to put the camera for your dancing and stuff like that. But these movies serve a very specific purpose, and so we kind of focus on those things that they do well because they know that what they're doing well and what their point is. And now I think even the Barkleys of Broadway, and even though again it's hard for me to think of the Barkleys of Broadway as not being what it is because it seems like everything just lined up perfectly for it. So
it's effectively an accident, but it's kind of a perfect accident.
Yeah, so let's transition over there and start talking about Barkleys of Broadway.
Jason, take it away.
The Barkleys of Broadway from 1949. The Barkleys, Josh and Dinah, are at the peak of the musical comedy scene, having just opened a new hit show with their composer friend, Ezra. But not everything is all right with the Barkleys. Dinah is a nervous wreck behind the scenes, with Josh claiming to be the Svengali behind their shared success. So when a stodgy French dramatist playwright comes along, praises her talent, and offers her a part in his new drama, it spells trouble for the Barkleys.
So this film is so perfect for what it is.
It's perfect. It is. It is an accident. So originally this film was not meant to be a reunion. And to put it into context, the final, kind of, sort of, the true ending of the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers partnership came after 9 movies, with 1939's Vernon and Irene Castle, which was a biopic. It was very different. It had a lot of fun in it, but it also had a very dark ending, which is kind of contrary to the formula to begin with. And at the same time, and it's come up before on podcasts, that there was the box office poison letter, which named several stars in Hollywood who were apparently box office poison. And of course, if you look at the numbers at the time, they weren't box office poison. The real thing that was going on was that tastes were shifting as the Depression came to an end, and a booming economy and warlike public focus started to zoom in as the 1940s began. So people like Katharine Hepburn were on the list, but Fred Astaire was also on that list. And with their diverging interests, Astaire wanting to establish himself as a solo dance act, really. He wanted to be known as a dancer in his own right, not just paired with somebody else, like he spent the first 20 years of his life with his sister, and then the next 10 with Ginger Rogers. And Ginger Rogers wanted to focus on her own career in dramatic acting. And in fact, if you look at most of her movies from then on, she doesn't really do many musicals or song and dance numbers except for the Barkleys of Broadway. The Barkleys of Broadway, of course, was not meant to be a reunion. Like I said, it was meant to be a piece between Fred Astaire and Judy Garland, but it was changed after Judy Garland had to leave the production for some reason. I don't remember what.
Health
People were
reasons,
leaving.
maybe. I think
People were
around
leaving
that time
production
of Easter Parade,
all
she
the
had
time.
health issues.
I would not be surprised. Judy Garland had a rough career with the studio system and her health. That they kind of screwed her up from a young age. Apparently, Wizard of Oz was made with quite a few pep pills given to the kid.
Gosh.
But oh yeah, no, classic Hollywood can get dark, y'all. But that is to say, we're focusing on one of the brighter points. Ginger Rogers stepped in at the last minute to continue the production and make sure that the investment would go through. And so they were able to revive their old partnership once more. And I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that this is by and far not their best movie, not by a long shot. It's not their worst movie either.
Alex, which is their best movie?
Which is their best movie? I hate doing bests. I can tell you what's not the best. Their best is probably, I hate to say it, it's probably Top Hat. That's probably like technically their best movie. It has some unfortunate content in there. It's got that one scene, which is actually meant to be a tribute on Fred Astaire's part. Not that it makes it okay, but
they were
it's meant to be a tribute. Yeah. Fred Astaire obviously was inspired by and developed a lot of his tap dancing techniques based off of African American dancers like Bill Bojangles Robinson and John Bubbles Sublette. It might be Sublette, I don't know. But essentially that led to a very unfortunate dance number in that movie, which is a shame because the rest of the movie is really, really good. But just like a very misjudged, not good, very 1930s decision of a entertaining dance, which also tracks with the histories of musical, considering what the first musical with Al Jolson had in it as well. So, while not great, that in some parts, that movie's probably technically, from a technical standpoint, their best, with a good movie to it, or a good plot to it, and some of the best dance numbers in it. And their worst might be something like Roberta, not for their performance, but for the fact that they just totally get sidelined in it. For no good reason, too, because it came out right after the Gay Divorcee, when they had established themselves as like a such a powerhouse of a pair. My only guess, and I haven't looked at the production dates to figure it out, but my only guess is that they made the Gay Divorcee kind of as both a promotion and a test of the partnership of Fred and Astaire.
Yeah.
And considering the production schedule of classical Hollywood, they were already making Roberta with Irene Dunn, who kind of took the spotlight in that one as a dramatic actor who doesn't do any song and dance in it. And they were kind of focusing on that. And then by the time the first movie came out and they were established as a hit, they had already begun making Roberta, so that was in the can as well. Because immediately in the next one, they start focusing on... They go back to focusing on our main two as the center spotlight, as they really should be.
All that to say,
anyway,
where
Jonathan,
does this film fit?
This film is fascinating. Well, we already talked about its production. But one of the most interesting things about this film, which you'd probably put in the middle of the pack, partially because it's a sub-in, partially because it's so long after their like career kind of ended, so they don't have that momentum that they used to have, and partially because the storyline itself, while kind of reflecting and having elements of their actual career trajectories, has so much meanness in it that
and
it doesn't jive with like their friendship, their friendly chemistry. Like they're so mean. The married couple's so mean to each other, and even at the end, I'm like, I don't like you two as a couple. Like,
yeah. So this is my biggest issue with the film is even if we kind of take the plot at face value, like, okay, so once, he realizes what he's lost after she's gone, blah, blah, blah. But it really doesn't give her a lot of, it like has this guise of giving Rogers' character a lot of empowerment. She needs to like go off and become a dramatic actress on her own, and she can do it without him. But then she can't do it without him because she still needs him to do the directing over the phone, even in disguise. So it's like she never actually got away from him or proved herself at all. She proved that she could be a dramatic actress, but she still had to have him be the one doing the directing and the urging. So
Yeah,
I was confused
end-
where I was supposed to fall on this, because he's still kind of the one pulling the strings. He just feels a little more bad about it by the end.
Yeah. At the very, because in the end, essentially, their toxic relationship is like validated. Like,
you don't even get this.
I
You
am
don't
your
even get the sense
Svengali.
that he's. You don't even get the sense that he's like changed his ways by the end.
No, he hasn't changed at all by the end of the film. Like, it essentially is just like another episode. Like, it's just another spat. Like,
So the
that's
other
the summation
interesting-
of their dramatic arc.
Yeah. So you brought up they make the Svengali comparison, but they also make
and
the
he's proved right in it at the end.
they also make the Pygmalion connection.
I knew you would catch that.
Well, okay, so yeah, and I mean, if you're going in that
I
direction,
still remember all of the glitter all over the high school.
it's not a My Fair Lady, like I don't know if it was trying to be a Pygmalion / My Fair Lady, but
I think a little bit.
There's not enough character development. Again, this kind of where it suffers. It's like they have like the beginnings of an idea of something along those lines, but there's so much emphasis just put on the dancing and their performances that they don't fully flesh out the rest of the story beats that could make it a really good drama.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, it's hard to tell sometimes with these mid-century productions what their goal is. Normally, it's kind of to, I guess, pump out like a genre film, because at this point, musicals had definitely faded from being A films to being B films. So it's an interesting production. And I think if it hadn't been a reteam of the original duo, then it would have really faded to like the bottom of their respective canons, and it would have been like maybe a C tier, D tier Fred Astaire film, and definitely that for Judy Garland. But it is, but because it's a reteam and because it follows like that same trajectory of him being more of a dancer, her wanting to go in dramatic acting, and the threatening of a partnership and the reunion of that partnership, it just feels like such a good place for them to end on as a duo. And it's a good place to compare and contrast the toxicity of the people's relationship in the film versus the amicability of the eventual split up of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, which, even calling it a split up, while technically accurate, doesn't feel justified in the way that it happened, because they both wanted to move on. They were both still supportive of each other after that fact. They remained friends, and whenever I haven't seen a lot of interviews with Ginger Rogers about it, although there is the famous quote that she did everything Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in heels. But if you read a lot of the quotes from Fred Astaire, he gives a lot of the credit to Ginger Rogers for making the pair work, especially in those earlier years where he couldn't act quite as well. And he never really considered himself a very good actor or singer for that point, even though a lot of people loved him as a singer. But their real partnership was so amicable that it couldn't make a good dramatic beat.
Yeah. And I just found on the production side of this on Wikipedia that apparently there had been rumors, although both of them denied it, that the working relationship for Astaire and Rogers was not particularly warm. That's the worst that anyone could even like rumor about them, is that it wasn't super warm. But they both denied it. So yeah, it is interesting that they do kind of they kind of play off of almost the rumors of what everyone thought their relationship was in this movie.
Yeah, I think they just had a very professional.
Yeah, they both seem
I
like
don't-
consummate. Like, we come in, we do the work, and we go home, and we
Yeah.
don't make a fuss about it.
Yeah, they end up feeling like friendly coworkers at the end of the day.
Yeah,
They're not. It's not like a lot of the other like star duos or team ups in Hollywood where they're probably busy in the dressing room at some point in time. It's just very professional, and like respect to them for keeping it that way.
yeah.
That wasn't necessarily a common thing in classic Hollywood, but they did that, and they focused on their work, and they did good work, and these films kind of still, even to this day, even though they no longer have the backdrop of the Great Depression to them, they still radiate the same kind of like cell of happiness and joy, and I guess verve, or what am I thinking
Joie
of?
de vivre.
Yeah, joie de vivre.
Yeah.
I try to drop as many letters from that as I did when I pronounced it. I don't know if I'm doing it right. French, come at me. But yeah, they still radiate that same happiness. The Barkleys of Broadway, unfortunately, does not. But it is fun in a lot of ways because we never got to see the team up before in color. We never got to see it in a more modern setting or after it. So it is the last taste of that team up in a lot of ways. And of course, again, they've both been at it for many, many years. So their skills have gotten better again, even though
They do feel a lot
chemistry
like
hasn't refined.
their dancing just feels so much like they have nothing to prove at this point. Like, they're just good at what they do, and they're not overdoing it. They're not like trying to, look how great I am. I'm the up and coming dancing star, or like trying to keep their place on top. They're just like, they know who they are, and they're so good. Like, I feel like there's so much just like grace and confidence in their dancing in this movie. And one of my favorites is the one where at the hospital benefit, when they dance together after they've had, their biggest blow up and all that. And then he sings the song I mentioned from Shall We Dance, the They Can't Take That Away From Me song, which feels, there's no way that was in there when this was supposed to be a Judy Garland movie, because that is so specifically for people who know the Astaire and Rogers like canon and relationship. Like, it feels like it goes, that's like a fourth wall break, just bringing that song into it at that moment. And then they have this whole dance, which again, according to Wikipedia, I guess when they shot it, that was the first time they had danced it together. So it feels very kind of like raw, and it's really good. It's not the most like spectacular dance in the film, but it's just a really good one to see, because there's a lot of like character drama and emotion going on within the dance. But the most spectacular one is probably the Shoes with Wings On dance. That was crazy.
That is some 1940s effects, if I've ever seen it.
It was beautiful.
It's a Fred Astaire mostly solo number. I guess there's other dancers involved, but he's definitely the focus. He's the focal point, and there's other shoes around him. Just
he's
shoes.
a cobbler. So this is part of their show on Broadway, and he's like in this scene. He's a cobbler, and he's making dancing
doing the Busby
shoes.
Berkeley thing.
Yeah,
where we're integrating the some of the musical numbers because only by virtue of it being
a show within the movie,
a show. And this musical number, even though it's one of the best in the picture and is definitely super entertaining and worth watching, doesn't have that much to do with a lot of
oh no, this is Fred Astaire's like, I'm just gonna dance now, and y'all are gonna watch me.
Fred. This is, you came to watch a Fred Astaire movie. Here's your Fred Astaire dance. Enjoy. And you very much do, because there's these other, he's a cobbler, he's dancing in his cobbler workshop, and there's essentially a series of shoes that form kind of Busby Berkeley-esque formations around him that are very
just
clearly
the shoes,
just the shoes, and they've it doesn't look like wires. It looks like some screen messing where they essentially
It's
Or
either
cut
green
out, like,
screened
green screened
or
out.
Luma replacement, where they had shot the dance sequence with all the dancers either all in black on a black stage and then put it over it, or just green screened out the dancers. But yeah, my favorite part about that scene is that the scene tells its own story, which is not as lighthearted as it seems, because it's really about a cobbler who overworks himself to the point where he imagines shoes dancing, and then he goes nuts and has to murder all of these magical shoes.
Welcome to the American dream, baby.
Because he literally ends the whole scene by just shooting all the dancing shoes until they stop dancing.
Overwork yourself until the point you have hallucinations.
Yep. So I will say this is a film, and this is a point that may carry us over into overall notes, but I want to bring up Oscar Levant, who is the third main character in this film, always seen with a woman of a different name. And he is
that the French guy?
No, this is the pianist.
Oh, this is Ezra.
Ezra, yeah. So Oscar Levant plays Ezra Miller, which I think is the actual name of another singer or something.
It sounds so real, right? Like,
I'm pretty sure, because I was thinking that.
Oh, you know what? It's the name of the guy who currently plays
That's right, he's the Flash.
The Flash. That's why we recognize him.
And that's not how he spells his name, but it sounds the same. Anyway, Oscar Levant is a professional concert pianist. He was also an actor, a TV show host, a radio host. But
very recognizable face.
He's so good, and there's just two full scenes where he just plays his freaking hands off on these really, really intricate classical numbers. Tchaikovsky.
I really enjoyed
something
those.
else. Dude, it made me want to learn the freaking piano. It's so good.
It was something that I haven't seen before in a lot of movies. I don't think I've ever seen maybe once in a blue moon you see a focus on someone performing music, but I've never seen a movie just focus in on the mesmerization involved in just watching someone.
This is what I want to talk about.
Perform a music, perform on an instrument. It is incredible, and I kind of wish there was some more of it. Out there.
This is what I want to talk about, because I think, and this may, like I said, transition us into overall notes. So unless you have something else to say about Barkleys of Broadway, I'm just going to go there.
No, go for it. Let's slide into overall notes. Actually, wait, Jonathan.
All right.
Let's not slide in. Shall we do overall notes?
Shall we tap our way into overall notes?
We shall.
So the inclusion of Oscar Levant and the inclusion of those two scenes where we are just watching him play the piano in almost continuous takes. There are some cutting away, but even in the Tchaikovsky scene where there's some of the Astaire and Rogers drama happening, cutting around it, there's still like 4 or 5 minutes where we're just watching him and the camera zooms in and zooms out, but it's just him playing the piano for real, doing really, really difficult work. And like you said, I kept thinking, we don't do that anymore. We don't just stop and let someone do their thing, show off their talent. And really, it's a microcosm of what all of these films are, because it's watching Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers do really difficult and technically masterful dancing. And I think when you're talking about that comparison with the way that these films kind of fill the same hole that we have with superhero movies now, or the same kind of slot, I think it's interesting that section of cinema and movie watching, which is kind of the easy sell for the producers because they know it's going to make a lot of money, easy to watch because it's entertaining and fun, but the emphases on those two types of movies are very different. With the Marvel films and the superhero stuff, it's a lot of emphasis on visual effects and aesthetic kind of overwhelm, for lack of a better term. But with these films, it's it has some of that, but it's, again, not in the same way as like a Busby Berkeley where it's just like visual overwhelm. This is, let's watch people who are really good at something do that thing. It's almost stage, but incorporated into a lot of the other strengths that film has in terms of storytelling. But there's not a lot of like that role in film right now, or maybe I just not watching those types of films. Isn't. But I mean, even
there is in places. There is in places, but they're made.
It's not so much popular part.
It's not a popular part. I think a lot of the disparity we see in the focus on some of those performances of different periods of Hollywood history. And again, I want to be careful about just confusing nostalgia for quality. But I do think, and a lot of this comes from having worked inside of a portion of the industry for some time, that a lot of our current state of film and TV essentially comes from, I don't want to blame technology. I don't want to blame specialization, but essentially the whole industry, sounds so cynical, but it's kind of true, has become essentially an assembly line where the goal is to get as much out the door as possible. And that's always, to a certain extent, been the case. Like in classical Hollywood, these people making multiple movies in 1 year, making 2 or 3 dance movies in 1 year, has always been the case.
And on balance, this has been a thing. Like literature has had the same history at points where it's like a writer becomes popular, and then the publishers or the patrons or whatever are just like, make as much of that as you can.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, right now, a lot of even book publishers right now are just publishing so much because they can. And essentially it's become, at least to a certain extent, profitable. Now, there's a whole discussion to be had about whether or not it's profitable and whether or not these streaming services will stay profitable in the future. I know Netflix just hiked its prices again, or is planning on hiking them in the near future. And I expect that to happen again. And essentially, I think there's going to be a holdout about who's going to hold out the prices the lowest, the longest, and how much people will, over the next decade, with continued economic troubles, will people be able to maintain multiple streaming services. I know I've given up a lot, partially for economic reasons, partially because I don't want to just have this mindless drip of content available to me. But I do think there is this thing that's happened where we just the focus is so much on quantity and not necessarily a lack of quality, because what we have is a lot of very specialized people who are very, very, very good at what they do. And they can write a really good script, or they can make a really good effects, or they're a really good performer. But there is a focus on pushing so much content out the door that people are just kind of slapping like these assembly line parts that are all really good.
Denominator.
Yeah. It's just, so you have a really good effects artist, a really good score, and you just slap it together. But the part that's lacking is basically kind of like the producer's role. Not that Hollywood suffers from lack of producers. There is definitely an overabundance of producers here in Hollywood.
But producers don't have the same kind of curation power that they did in the studio system.
So in the early studio system, and probably chief among them, maybe to a bit of like a hagiographic, like essentially like turned him into a saint when he was just a person, degree, is Irving Thalberg, who was one of the young producers at Paramount, I believe, and essentially became like the guy that everybody knew, even like a household name. Everybody knew him. He was the guy who kind of made Hollywood early on, before eventually directors kind of took that niche with the wave of academic writing that came out of France about directors and auteur theory. But even that didn't really change essentially the need for somebody to be there to be the tastemaker. Somebody needs to make the taste and decide what's good and what's bad. And I'm not saying that people, individuals, aren't good at what at having taste and deciding what's good or what's bad. But I think the problem is essentially we've surrendered the idea of what's good or what's bad to an algorithm on these streaming sites that just demands more, always new. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah.
We no longer have, and I've talked about this one before in the podcast too, but we no longer have this correlation between individual performance of a media and its success or its influence on other things after that. Like we don't have one thing is good, so we'll make other things in that style necessarily because things fade too quickly from the public mind. So there's trends that get followed, but there's not necessarily homages or that art or what really needs to happen in art, which is it's necessary for art to continue and evolve to essentially be stolen and broken apart and remixed by other people who appreciate it. And we're not seeing that happen. And while we do see people who are really good at their individual crafts and making these things, there's no conscious production happening. It's all very much like a switch has been flipped on a machine and it is just going. And at no point are people stopping to think or stopping to essentially spell the flowers and watch some dude perform on a piano for a little while. It's all about getting all the coverage in a day, shooting it maximum amount of coverage in a day, making it's become such a logistical endeavor to make a movie, which always has been to a certain extent, that there's very rarely any room for true like art anymore.
Yeah, but even
not that these people are good at what they're doing. I'm saying that there is no room for conscious innovation, change, remixing, or experience within a system that's so focused on quantity.
But even beyond that, I mean, even if there was someone out there who was like, I want to make something that's like really focuses on like stars aren't the same type of stars as the Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers. You know, we have actors, but we don't have the same kind of triple threat talent, like someone who is a master dancer or even just finding like a master concert pianist that we can showcase in that sort of way. And I think that was kind of driven home for me with Hail Caesar, where they tried to put Channing Tatum as Gene Kelly type. And even like, you know, the musicals, the more modern musicals like La La Land, which has its strengths, but Ryan Gosling is still not exactly a triple threat. Like you can teach him to dance, you can teach Channing Tatum to dance, but they're not Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers.
Yeah, that's very true as well. I mean, there is a lot of discussion, and you see it thrown around a lot about how there are no more movie stars in Hollywood. There's actors, but there's no movie stars.
Yeah. And again, I like the people that you might like put in that place would be like a.
I always think of like Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise.
Yeah, I was gonna say Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, even some of the older guys like Robert De Niro or something like that. But again, they're actors. They are the Douglas Fairbankses. You know, they're not the Charlie Chaplins or the Fred Astaires or Gene Kellys.
At some point, I think it got so focused on individual crafts that we lost sight of the whole picture. It's weird to say, but I think I genuinely think we're
basically the point is we're so far away from vaudeville, which vaudeville also had its strengths and weaknesses, but
bit of a hot mess vaudeville.
The beginnings of Astaire and Rogers' career, like we said, Astaire was literally trained for vaudeville, and vaudeville was a person. It was a talent show. A person gets up and does something really, really well, and then the next person gets up and does their thing really, really well, and but we don't really have a place for vaudeville anymore, unless it's YouTube or TikTok or something like that.
Very, very true.
So, but I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, right? Let's try and keep this on. Both of those also have like the devil of the algorithm haunting them. Right, right. Which is just which is terrifying. Yeah, that is the kind of overarching God in the machine right now.
Yeah.
But
the one thing I've learned from our study of I've learned many things from our study of over 400 movies at this point. Not to humble brag on that or anything, but to humble brag on that would be that the idea of chasing a trend is almost always bad.
yeah,
And the idea of making your own trend or your own style, like so many of these older people did within a space free of an algorithm, is not always a guaranteed success, but it is a guaranteed path towards growth and developing your own style and having a chance at making something big and interesting. Whereas following a trend, you will always just be part of the trend. Even if you get a lot of clicks on it, you will always just be part of the trend. And now we have big, massive media corporations that all they do is follow a trend. And I don't think that's good. But anyway, back to Astaire and Rogers. That was to all say that they were, as much as they were individual triple threat performers, they were, to an extent, and very complicitly so, products of a star machine in Hollywood that put them together.
yeah,
They wouldn't have been put together had the studio not decided. The eponymous they, essentially, decided that, or realized that they were essentially box office gold together. So
until they decided they were box office poison.
Exactly. Yes.
It's a rough sea out there in the studio system.
Yes. Yeah. Which in some ways you could say was the algorithm of the day, but it had more conscious thought about it.
It's the difference between having TurboTax do your money and having a CPA do your money. It's like a person is actually going through this versus literally a computer is just making the numbers work.
Yeah, computers tend to miss nuance very easily. I don't care how good your algorithm is.
And when it comes to not your taxes, but like people and talent, it's a lot easier for another person to decide who has talent than an algorithm who doesn't know if this is getting a lot of views, like hate views, or if people are actually enjoying what they're watching.
As someone who has to continue to work on more seasons of Emily in Paris, one of the most hate-watched shows on Netflix, yeah, that's true.
Gosh.
But yes, so they were products of their time very much. That was why they were paired together. But I also think that as talented as they were individually, there was a lot of merit actually in putting them together because they shone twice as bright when put together, maybe even three times. A sum greater than a unit greater than the sum of its parts, if you will.
Yeah.
But yeah, they were amazing together. And in fact, we've already mentioned her a couple times this episode that they had that star quality, and we've also mentioned Katharine Hepburn a couple times. But she has a famous quote about them, or maybe not famous, but a well-known quote about them, saying that he gives her class and she gives him sex appeal, which in the early ones is very true, because they kind of have that interaction together, and especially considering their backgrounds with Ginger Rogers kind of starting off as a chorus line girl, or literally a character called Anytime Annie in 42nd Street, which we all know what that means. Before they paired together, and they kind of essentially not only were able to give the chance to have that star moment together and have all these giant films together, but also get the chance to grow together. And it shows in their later work, which we're not going to highlight here, but you can see even in like the Barkleys of Broadway that they have grown based off of their interaction with one another. You can see that Fred Astaire has grown as an actor by the end of it, both through his own efforts and by being around someone who has that interest as well. And vice versa, Ginger Rogers has grown as a dancer.
And they had
their tenure together.
So many interactions with the other stars of the day at that point, not including, like, aside from each other, but with, Fred Astaire doing so much work with Bing Crosby and even Gene Kelly and some of the other dancers. And same with Ginger Rogers, like you said, doing stuff with the Cary Grants and the other actors of the day. Like by the time they started together to the point where they come back together for Barkleys of Broadway, there's just so much experience between them both that again, they just kind of have that solid confidence and maturity in their performances and their dancing, even if the story is not as fun as the other ones that they had done. And like we said, like Astaire, he did sort of bring the musical to a point where the music was incorporated into the story, but he still had a huge focus on getting the dancing technically correct. I mean, that's what he did. And there's a anecdote from Ruben Mamoulian, who I think directed Silk Stockings, which was not Astaire and Rogers, but it was Fred Astaire and Sid Charisse or something. And
oh yeah, Sid Charisse.
But Fred Astaire had like choreographed this whole scene, and Mamoulian didn't like it because it didn't convey the drama of the scene, although it was technically correct. And so like the producers and everyone is there watching Fred Astaire and Sid Charisse do the scene, and they're all like, "Oh yeah, Fred, you're great. That was wonderful. You did, so good." And Mamoulian's like, "I didn't like it. It didn't get the drama across that I wanted. So you're gonna have to go back and redo it so that it fits with the scene." And everyone's like, "What are you doing? Are you telling Fred Astaire what to do? Are you telling him how to dance?" He's like, "No, I'm not telling him how to dance. I'm telling him what to dance." And sure enough, Fred Astaire was a little grumpy, but then they came back, and because Mamoulian was like, "I think he's too much of a professional to not realize that what I'm saying is going to help the story." And so sure enough, 2 days later, he comes back and just nailed it, and then it was perfect.
Every anecdote I've heard about how Fred Astaire works through a dance showed that he cared very much about how it was performed and did not have too much of an ego about it. In fact, quite the opposite problem. His friend and co-choreographer on a lot of his films, Hermes Pan, normally said that Astaire was worried that he was never good enough for most of his performances. And even if you watch, the most ready example might be if you go watch his performance at the 1970-something Oscars, where he does a little dance number. And you can tell that he's really enjoys dancing and performing, but he's also a little embarrassed to do it. he's like, it's actually kind of adorable because he's like hiding his face a little bit. He's like, "Oh, shucks, guys, thanks. I didn't think you'd like that." You can tell he's nervous about performing at an older age in such a public venue. But he was a good guy through and through, it seems, and people liked working with him, and he was easier to work with. And I actually don't remember who it was, but I feel like we've mentioned it on a podcast before. And this isn't a knock on Gene Kelly. It's just to show the difference of their styles and how they worked. There was an actress who would dance regularly with both Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire. And when she came home, her husband could tell who she'd been dancing with based on whether or not she had like bruises on her feet from going so hard on the dance floor, which would be Gene Kelly.
Yeah.
Gene Kelly was very much the more intense, masculine, strong dancer, whereas Fred Astaire was much more graceful and gentle, and he had all this focus on style and technique. And actually, I like that you brought up that Mamoulian quote, because Fred Astaire focused more on the style of his dances than he did on the theme of his dances. Mm-hmm. He was never one to really try to tell a whole story through a dance. I think he naturally developed a talent over the years for capturing a mood or a tone or theme through dance. And that shows, especially in a lot of the later musicals with him and Rogers, especially something like Shall We Dance with the roller skate scene, or some of the more emotional dances in that one where they're saying goodbye to each other, or even in some of the dances in the Barkleys of Broadway, which feel more themed and story-based rather than some of the earlier ones like the Gay Divorcee, where it's like, I'm a dancer, this is part of the story, but mostly it's like, stop and watch me dance.
Yeah.
Do.
Yeah.
And we do have to say that, much like the Marvel movies, these movies did introduce a lot of the pop culture for the 30s. In fact, a lot of the songs that were really big in the 30s, like the Continental for some period of time, were first introduced through these movies, and the first person who ever sang them in pop culture would have been like Fred Astaire, even if he didn't write them. So there's that. Astaire also influenced future dance techniques or styles like American smooth ballroom, which is still very popular to this day. You can see it on a lot of stuff like Dancing with the Stars.
Yeah, it felt a lot like that style of
very
those
much
ballroom
so.
dances that they do.
Yeah, and between him and Gene Kelly, they basically set the standard for on-screen dance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, on-screen dance as a whole, and this is maybe the most telling part, didn't last very long beyond them.
Yeah,
it's
which
still
again goes back
around
to
in places.
we don't have the same kinds of talent, or we're not searching for the same kinds of talent to put into our film roles.
Yeah, and I think the lack of musicals today can be, to a certain extent, you can chalk it up to lack of public interest. But like I kind of hinted at before, the public doesn't really I'm going to say this as nicely as possible. They'll watch anything. NCIS has been on the air for 20 years. 20 years. Essentially, like Americans, audiences writ large, will watch what you show them. And essentially, you can influence their taste by showing them different things. So to your point, Jonathan, I think the lack of song, dance, triple threat talents contributes to the lack of song, dance, triple talents.
Yeah.
If with fewer of them to show off in higher toned productions, people experience it less, and then you have less people seeking out that kind of performance. It's kind of like a self-enforcing circle in a huge way.
Yeah. But I can't imagine that there's no one out there who's a very talented dancer who would, who doesn't also want to be in film. Like you can find someone. That's what talent scouts were for. I just think they're not looking for them. Anyway.
Yeah.
And I guess there's not a system to build them up in that way too, because that was also part of the studio system. Is like, you find a really great dancer like Fred Astaire and you teach him the dramatic acting, or vice versa, and then you find the ones who pick it up well enough to become a triple threat. So
essentially everyone is expected to develop their talent on their own, which isn't necessarily bad. I mean, Fred Astaire basically developed a lot of his talent on his own. Ginger Rogers did as well. But when you try to fit them into a bigger part of a picture, sometimes they need help with that, or they'll need an accent coach or something like that.
Yeah.
Not that those things aren't available, but they're less systematically available.
Like
if La La Land had been made...
Sorry, you said accent coach.
I know. If La La Land had been made in the 50s or even the 60s, we would have had... probably for a few years beforehand, Scarlett Johansson and Ryan. Was it Scarlett Johansson in La La Land? I can't remember.
Oh gosh, no, it was
Ryan Gosling and
oh gosh, redhead. Oh gosh.
I feel bad for not remembering.
Emma Stone,
that's it. They would have basically been in dancing lessons for like a year or two beforehand, which I'm not saying they didn't take dancing lessons for this one, but they would have been, basically like going to school professionally to perform for that one role, if that had been the case. Or the studio already would have had like people more suited to that doing that role, which is interesting. In many ways. And that isn't to say that everything made these days is bad, or that everything made in yesteryear was good. But I do think we can learn from the past how to make improvements in the future.
Yeah.
We can also learn how to avoid certain pitfalls. It's
like I said, it's just interesting to see what, like, those things that do fill that popular popcorn candy kind of role, what the emphasis in those films is and how that changes, as opposed to, just necessarily the way, because they all have their strengths and weaknesses, especially that the really mainstream fare is always going to be lacking in something. But where the strengths is, where the public is wanting to see those strengths or where the studios thinks the public wants to see those strengths is interesting to watch change over time.
Yep. We've definitely talked about this for too long. So, do we want to talk about what we're going to talk about next month on the podcast, Jonathan?
Yeah, see? What we're going to talk about next time on the podcast is gangster movies. We're going to go a little bit different, see? It's not going to be the same, see, as dancing, see? It's going to be gangsters, see?
Yeah, so next time on the show, we're going to be talking about gangster movies, mostly tracking through the American gangster genre from all the way from back in the 30s up to the 90s, and it's kind of stagnated from that point. But that's
there was
okay,
Gangster Squad, Alex.
Oh my gosh. I guess stagnated is probably the wrong term. It's probably just changed in a lot of ways. But the high-profile ones, like The Irishman, can be traced back to essentially the ones in the 90s.
Yeah.
Because they're basically made by the same
It's
guy.
all just homage now.
Oh, yeah. But we'll be talking about Scarface from 1932, which was directed by Howard Hawks and stars Paul Mooney, one of the classic gangsters of silver screen fame. Then we'll be talking about Angels with Dirty Faces from 1938, which is one of the famous gangster movies starring the one and only James Cagney, who he and himself was actually more of a song and dance man, but kind of got pigeonholed into being a gangster more often than not. And that one was directed by Michael Curtiz of Casablanca fame. Mm-hmm. Then we'll be talking about Scarface from 1983, directed by Brian De Palma, which I think might be the first Brian De Palma film we talk about on the show, but definitely one of the famous, most influential genre filmmakers of the 80s who influenced people like Quentin Tarantino to a large degree. And that one stars Al Pacino, and obviously, if you can't tell...
Oh, we did The Untouchables.
There you go. Oh, was The Untouchables Brian De Palma?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would explain a lot. And if you can't tell, Scarface is a redux of the 1930s version, and it's kept fairly close. It just has like an hour extra runtime, and then I guess a Cuban angle to it. Although both are immigrant society, so it will be interesting to see.
A lot more murder or like on-screen death. And
a lot
F-bombs.
more explicit. Both of them, 1932 Scarface wrestles with the code in a very, very interesting way.
It's going to be really interesting to watch how
tacked on scene,
because like the essence of gangster movies is so anti-code that it's going to be really interesting to watch that development.
Yeah, essentially for gangster movies, in order to survive in an era with code, they had to become morality plays, which further influenced the genre later on. And in Scarface in 1983, even when people were used to seeing blood and gore on screen, there still is a lot of homage to the original code kowtowing that you see in Scarface from 1932, which is really interesting. I really enjoy watching that kind of stuff and seeing that stuff echo through decades of filmmaking. And then, of course, we have to talk about Goodfellas from 1990, directed by Martin Scorsese. Pretty much the cornerstone gangster film of the most recent few decades that kind of set the tone for most things that came afterwards. That one stars Robert De Niro, obviously, Ray Liotta, and Joe Pesci, very famously. You may notice that The Godfather is missing from the list, and there's a few reasons for that, including the fact that we've done a whole episode just on the Godfather series. So if you're interested in The Godfather, you can go watch the Godfather episode. I don't remember what number it is, but
81.
it is. Wow. Okay.
I just looked it up.
It's episode 81. So you can check that out. But Jonathan, what is going on the Patreon?
Yeah, if you want to support us, we do have a Patreon account. You can go over there. You can join the Discord, which is open to anyone. Patrons get a few extra perks, like being able to listen to the show as it's being recorded live. Also, you get the bonus podcast. And the last time on the bonus podcast, for the last bonus podcast of 2021, we talked about The Memphis Belle, directed by William Wyler. And that went along with our last episode, and we're going to be continuing the dancing conversation coming up in a week or so with a short film that fit ended up fitting with this topic way better than I expected. So you can hear us talk about that if you join on the Patreon.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
To find links to things that we talked about today, as well as a complete list of past episodes and all 410 films we've covered so far, visit thefilmlings.com.
You can also join us for ongoing film discussions on our Discord server.
And to stay posted about upcoming episodes, follow us on Twitter at thefilmlings.
Summaries for each of the films this episode were recorded by me, Jason Harden. You can find me on Twitter at TheBlueJay1994.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya. Shall We Pod? That's our new podcast, all about dance movies.
We are the Shadlings.
The Shallings. That sounds like a mystical cult. The Shallings.
Yes, we now have to induct all the members.
With a blood oath.
Yeah, we will need a sample of everyone's blood to conduct this oath. Jonathan, get the goat sacrifice.